Montana Territory. August 1879. The river had nearly taken her by the time he spotted the limp form snagged on a low branch near the bend. Conrad Vexley kicked his horse hard, leaping from the saddle before the animal had stopped. The water was fast, cruel, and cold, and she was face down, her dress tangled in a swirl of mud and reeds. He did not hesitate. Conrad plunged in, boots dragging in the current, chest burning from the cold. His hands found her waist first, then her shoulders. She was heavier than she looked, soaked through and lifeless. He cursed under his breath and yanked her free, hauling her onto the muddy bank like a man possessed. "Come on," he muttered, falling to his knees beside her. He turned her over. Her skin was pale, lips near blue, dark lashes clumped against cheeks dusted with silt. "No, no, you breathe, you hear me." He pressed down on her chest, hard and fast. Then again, and again. Water burst from her lips, followed by a choking gasp. Conrad caught her in his arms as she coughed, her body convulsing with life. He pulled her close, pressing her against him as her eyes fluttered open in confusion and pain. "I did not ride 2 days to bury you," he said, voice low and hoarse. "You are not dying here." "Not like this," she blinked, her voice barely a rasp. "Conrad." His heart stilled. "Zadie," her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. She stared up at him like she was seeing a ghost. "It's really you." He could not speak. For a moment, he just looked at her, older now, thinner, bruised by something cruel, but it was her. Zadie Allender. The girl he had once promised to marry, before war and pride and distance had torn their paths apart. He scooped her up in his arms, carrying her to his saddlebags where he had a dry blanket. His horse nickered nearby, restless. "I thought you were dead," he finally said, laying her down gently and wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "Last I heard, you married a man in Helena." "I never married," she whispered. "He left, took everything and left me with the children." Conrad froze. "Children," Zadie nodded. "Gabriel and Grace. They are 5. He left 3 months ago. We had no food. I tried to get work, but no one would hire a woman with 2 little ones. I tried to get them to my sister. We were crossing the river. It was too fast. I lost hold of the raft." Her voice cracked. "They are still out there." Conrad was already on his feet. "Where did you leave them?" "An old barn. About a mile back. Other side of the ridge." He was moving before she finished, throwing his rifle over his shoulder, tightening the saddle. "Stay warm." "I will bring them." "You cannot go alone." She tried to sit up, but the effort nearly dropped her again. He turned, his eyes hard. "Zadie, listen to me. I am getting them. You just keep breathing." She watched him vanish into the trees, her chest aching in more ways than one. The last time she had seen Conrad Vexley was in 1871. He had kissed her goodbye, promised to return once he'd saved enough to build them a life. But letters stopped after a year. She thought he had forgotten her. She had tried to move on, but she had never stopped loving him. And now, out of nowhere, he had come back, just in time to pull her out of the river. When Conrad returned nearly an hour later, dusk had fallen. He was out of breath, soaked with sweat, but he had both children in his arms, one on each hip. Gabriel stared at Zadie with wide eyes. Grace clung to his neck like a kitten. "Mama!" Gabriel ran to her the moment Conrad set him down. Zadie reached for them, tears streaking her face as she wrapped her arms around both. "You are safe. You are safe." Conrad stood a few feet away, watching the reunion in silence. Zadie looked up at him, her arms still around her children. "You found them." "I said I would." She nodded, eyes shining. "Thank you." He crouched beside her, his hand brushing her wet hair from her face. "I will get you all to shelter. There is a cabin a few hours north. Belongs to an old friend. You need rest." "We cannot stay long," she whispered. "I have nothing left." "You have me," he said, so simply it stopped her breath. Zadie looked at him, really looked. His jaw was rough with stubble, his shirt torn at the shoulder. He looked tired, older. But his eyes, the same green that once made her heart race, still held the same steady fire. "You came for me," she said, voice trembling. "I never stopped wanting to." She reached for his hand. He took it, without hesitation. They rode through the night, Conrad keeping Zadie close in front of him on the saddle, the children bundled against his back. He whispered to her now and then, promises he had once made and never forgotten. By the time they reached the cabin, the stars had faded into gray. He helped her down gently, carried both sleeping children inside and laid them on furs by the hearth. Then he built a fire, lit a lantern, and turned to her. "I know this is not how things were supposed to be," Conrad said, "but you are here, and I am here. That is enough for me." Zadie stepped closer. "You saved me, Conrad." He touched her cheek. "You are all I ever wanted." She leaned into his chest, and he held her like something precious he had almost lost forever. "I am never letting you go again," he whispered into her hair. She closed her eyes. "Then do not." The cabin sat quiet and low beneath a line of pines, smoke curling from the chimney in the still morning air. The inside smelled of ash and old pine sap, the warmth of the fire pushing back the chill that came with first light. Zadie sat near the hearth on a woven stool, her clothes drying near the fire on a line Conrad had strung across the rafters. An old wool shirt of his hung loosely from her frame, sleeves rolled past her elbows. The children still slept wrapped in pelts on a straw mattress in the corner, noses pink from the cold night. "You ate?" Conrad asked, stepping in from outside. His boots were damp from the dew, and he carried a canvas sack over one shoulder. His voice was low, careful not to wake the little ones. "Some," she said, not looking up. The bread was hard, but it was good. He set the sack down on the table and pulled out a tin of dried apples and a wedge of cheese. "I'll ride to the trading post tomorrow. I can get flour, beans, maybe a bit of salt pork if the price hasn't climbed again." She nodded, fingers tangled in her lap. "You don't have to do all that." He glanced at her, then poured water into a tin cup from the kettle and handed it to her. "I'm not doing it out of pity." Zadie took the cup, her hand still trembling faintly. "You always did take on more than was yours to carry." Conrad leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Don't see it that way." She looked over at him then, the firelight casting gold across her cheek. "You could have kept riding." "I could have," he said. "But I didn't." They fell quiet, the only sound the fire's soft crackle and the faint rhythm of Gabriel's breathing across the room. Outside, something rustled near the edge of the trees, a squirrel or a bird, maybe. The world felt held in place, like it was waiting. Zadie's voice came soft. "I didn't know where you'd gone. After the letters stopped, I thought maybe you joined up again, or married." "I was working cattle down near Abilene," he said. "Got jumped one summer driving a herd. Took a shot through the side. Took me near 6 months to walk proper again. By the time I could write, I figured you'd already moved on." She drew her knees to her chest, the cup warming her fingers. "I nearly did. Tried to believe it was for the best." He stepped closer, pulling a chair near her. "But it wasn't." She met his eyes. "No, it wasn't." For a long time, neither said anything. The fire shifted, casting new shadows across the log walls. Then Grace stirred in her sleep, letting out a sleepy sigh. Zadie glanced at her, a faint smile softening her lips. "Gabriel's got your eyes," Conrad said after a moment. Zadie turned toward him, startled. "What makes you say that? They're wide like yours. See everything. Don't miss a thing." She looked down, brushing a hand across her knee. "He asks questions I can't always answer. About why his father left. Why we had to leave our house. Why I cry sometimes when I think I'm alone." Conrad leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You don't have to answer all of them. You just have to be there. I didn't expect to raise them alone." Her voice was bare now, scraped down to truth. "I kept thinking if I just worked harder, stopped complaining, it would get better." "You didn't fail them," he said. "You did what you could with what you had." She looked over at him, her eyes tired but clear. "I don't know how to trust anyone anymore," he nodded slowly. "Then we start slow." They sat in that silence again, the kind that didn't demand anything, a silence that gave space instead of taking it. After a while, she stood and went to check the children, tucking the blanket tighter around Gabriel's feet. Conrad watched her, the way her fingers moved gently without hesitation. When she turned back, her voice was quieter. "I can help at the trading post, maybe clean or mend things. I won't just take from you." "You're not," he said. "You're here." That's enough. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree either. Instead, she crossed to the table and began cutting the cheese into small squares, arranging them carefully on a tin plate. The domestic rhythm, small, deliberate, settled something in the air. Conrad stood and took the plate from her, setting it near the fire for when the children woke. "You can stay as long as you need. No one's coming for this place." "Whose cabin was it?" she asked. "Belonged to a man named Grady Finch. Died 3 winters back. No kin left. He used to say the trees kept him company better than people." Zadie smiled faintly. "I understand that more than I used to." He looked at her, then pulled the blanket from the drying line and draped it around her shoulders without a word. She didn't flinch. "I'll fetch more wood," he said after a beat. "You warm them up when they wake." She nodded. "I will." He stepped outside, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Zadie stood there a moment, the blanket heavy and warm across her back. She looked toward the fire, then toward the children, then finally at the door. And for the first time in months, her shoulders eased, not in surrender but in rest. The morning passed with the hush of a place long forgotten by roads. Conrad took to chopping wood behind the cabin, shirt damp with effort, while Zadie boiled water for washing and rinsed out the children's spare clothing in the creek-fed bucket beside the hearth. Gabriel helped her rinse, his small hands clumsy but eager. Grace sat nearby, threading pine needles onto a string with quiet concentration. By midday, the sun had warmed the clearing, and Conrad brought in a haunch of venison wrapped in oilcloth, traded from a trapper passing through 2 days earlier. He laid it on the table and glanced toward Zadie, who was wringing out a pair of stockings with her sleeves rolled past her elbows. "You ever dress game?" he asked, pulling a knife from the belt at his hip. "Once," she replied, brushing damp hair from her forehead. "But it came wrapped in brown paper and cost more than I had to spare." He nodded and began slicing. "We'll stew it with what's left of the carrots. That'll keep us through the next few days." When she came to stand beside him, her eyes followed the knife's clean cuts. "You always this well supplied?" "Only when I plan ahead," he said. "Most winters I don't." She reached for the pot and carried it to the fire. "How long you been alone?" He trimmed a strip of fat and set it aside. "Since Grady passed. Before that I was drifting. Cattle drives, fence work, whatever paid clean." "You ever think about settling?" she asked, voice quiet as she stirred the water. "Not until now." She didn't respond, but her hands stilled and she looked toward the window where sunlight filtered through pine boughs. That night, after the stew had been eaten and the children tucked beneath Conrad's spare coat, Zadie stepped out onto the porch. The moon was pale above the trees, the air sharp with the scent of resin and damp earth. She drew the wool shawl tighter around her shoulders and leaned against the post. "You can see the whole ridge from here," she said when Conrad stepped out beside her. He nodded, arms crossed loosely. "Hawk nests up there come spring. You'll hear them before you see them." She looked toward the slope, her face unreadable in the dim light. "You remember the first time we talked about leaving Montana? Beside your father's barn," he said. You were holding a basket of eggs and I was bleeding from the jaw. She laughed, the sound soft and surprised. That's right. You'd fought Levy Baines over that bay mare he claimed you stole. He said if I ever looked your way again, he'd finish what he started. She turned to him, the night catching the edges of her face. You didn't listen. No, he said gently. I didn't. The wind stirred the trees, and somewhere far off an owl called low and steady. Neither of them moved. Conrad, she said, her voice low. I don't know what you think this is me being here, but I can't promise anything. Not yet. I'm not asking you to, he said. I'm just asking you to stay. She looked at him then, really looked, as though searching for something she wasn't sure she'd find. You still wear that same look when you mean something. He met her eyes. And I mean this. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached up, the back of her fingers brushing the line of his jaw, where stubble had grown in dark and rough. I didn't think I'd feel anything again, she whispered. You don't have to call it anything, he said. Just let it be. She stepped closer, her hand still resting against his face. I was drowning long before that river took me, and I'll keep pulling you out, he said. As long as it takes. He reached for her hand and held it, not like a promise but like a tether. She didn't pull away. Inside, the fire had dimmed to embers. Gabriel stirred once and pressed closer to his sister. Outside, the wind ran its fingers through the trees, and the porch creaked under their weight, but neither of them moved. Zadie leaned her head against Conrad's shoulder, and he rested his chin there, silent. They stayed like that until the moon was lost behind the ridge. The land turned richer as September settled in, the hills warming under a yellowing sky. Mornings began with frost along the high grass and ended in soft winds that smelled of dry hay and pine dust. The cabin took on a rhythm quiet but steady. Zadie mended, Conrad hauled. Gabriel followed Conrad's every step, and Grace took to whispering stories to the trees behind the chicken coop they'd built from salvaged boards. On a Thursday, Zadie carried a pail of milk back from the neighbor's Holstein, an old cow owned by a widow named Mrs. Yates, who lived a half-mile down the trail. Conrad was splitting fence rails out near the ridge when she found him, sleeves rolled, arms working smooth and sure with every swing of the axe. Mrs. Yates said her son's coming back from Missoula, Zadie said, setting the pail near his boots. She asked if we'd help clear some brush from her northern field before snow takes root. Conrad leaned on the handle. You think she'd let me use that plow she keeps under the lean-to? She might. She said you've got a straightforward manner. He gave a quiet chuckle, wiping sweat from his brow. That's one way to say it. Zadie stepped closer, the hem of her skirt brushing dead grass. You think the soil here's worth turning? For a garden, maybe. Near the creek, the earth's dark enough, he said. Might give you potatoes. Beans if the deer don't get them first. She looked out toward the lower slope, where the pines opened wide enough for sun to warm the earth. I never planted anything of my own, always borrowed ground. He studied her profile, the way her jaw held steady even when her eyes carried doubt. You're not borrowing anymore, he said. This place has room. Zadie didn't answer right away. She crouched beside the pail, dipped a finger in, and traced a circle in the dust. Gabriel asked me this morning what your last name was. I told him Vexley, and he said it sounded like something out of a tall tale. Conrad set the axe aside and leaned on the fence post he'd just anchored. He's not wrong. He also asked if you were going to stay forever. Her voice thinned, uncertain. Conrad didn't look away. What did you tell him? I said you built the chicken coop, and you don't do that if you're planning on riding off. The wind moved through the trees, slow and dry. Conrad stepped forward, close enough she could see the faint scar along the edge of his temple, the one that hadn't been there 8 years ago. I'm not going anywhere, Zadie, he said. But I won't fill their heads with promises unless you want me to. She stood, the wind catching her shawl. They already look for you in the morning. They eat more when you're at the table. He brushed his hand against the edge of hers. You, her voice caught. I sleep. He reached for her wrist gently, not pulling, just holding. What are you afraid of? That it won't last, she said. That this peace is just the eye of the storm. I know storms, he said. This isn't one. Her hand slid into his then, fingers threading through without hesitation. They stood beside the half-finished fence as the light shifted golden across the ridge, the smell of cedar heavy in the air. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep with full bellies and warm feet, Zadie stood at the wash basin, drying her hands on a linen cloth. Conrad sat at the table, sorting through the few coins he had left and marking a list on a scrap of paper. I've been thinking, she said. He looked up. If we put in a root cellar before frost comes, we could keep more than just turnips, maybe get some salt meat from town. You planning to dig it yourself? He asked, brow lifted. No, she said, folding the cloth, but I'll help. I know you will, he said. You don't sit idle. She came to his side, leaned a hip against the table. I want this to work, Conrad. I'm still learning how to say that without flinching. He set the pencil down. You just did. She reached for his face, ran her thumb slow along his cheekbone. You make it feel possible. He caught her hand in his, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. It is. She bent and kissed him slow, sure, nothing hurried. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers, and the quiet between them was warm. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling dry leaves across the porch. Inside, they stood close, the fire low, the night deepening around them. And for the first time in a long while, they weren't waiting for something to break. They were building something meant to last. By mid-October, the trees along the ridge had turned every shade of copper and wine. Frost came heavy before dawn, laying white lace over the cabin roof and the still green tops of the last carrots in the plot near the creek. The root cellar was finished, dug deep behind the cabin and lined with stone. Conrad had braced it with timber scavenged from a collapsed line shack 3 miles north. Zadie had packed it with jars from Mrs. Yates' pickled beets, stewed apples, and salt beans traded for mending and firewood. On a late afternoon colored by low clouds and the scent of snow not far off, Zadie and Conrad stood on the porch, watching Gabriel and Grace gather pine cones into their apron folds. I sent a letter to my brother, she said, arms folded tight against the cold. In Bozeman. He wrote back last week. Said he'd thought I was gone too. Conrad glanced at her. He offer anything, a place in his barn. She smiled, faint but real. But he said if I'd found a better man than the last, I ought to stay put. Conrad looked back out at the clearing. Then he's got sense. She reached for his hand. I told him we were all right here. He turned his palm upward and threaded their fingers. You believe it? I do. Inside, a kettle hissed on the stove. Grace called out for a ribbon she'd dropped, and Gabriel shushed her like he'd seen Conrad do when splitting fence posts. Zadie stepped down into the yard and picked up the ribbon, tucking it into Grace's hand without a word. The girl beamed and ran back to her brother. They sleep better now, Zadie said as she walked back to Conrad. They don't ask for things I can't give. He touched her wrist, thumb brushing just once. You give them more than you know. That night, after the children were settled and the fire burned low, Conrad pulled down a small cedar box from the shelf above the hearth. He opened it carefully, lifting out a folded length of blue calico. I bought this in Helena, he said. Years back, meant it for you once, thought I'd never get the chance to give it. She unfolded the fabric slowly. The pattern was simple, a scatter of tiny white blooms, but the cloth was fine, unused. I'd forgotten that shade, she said softly. I wore something like it the day you left. He stepped closer. I remember. She held the cloth to her chest, then met his eyes. I never thought I'd want to wear something pretty again. You don't have to dress up for me, he said. I know. She smiled, and this time it reached her whole face. But I want to. He leaned in, resting his forehead against hers. You're home now, Zadie. She kissed him, slow and deliberate, her hands at his collar, his arms pulling her into the quiet heat between them. There was no rush, no hunger, only the soft, certain knowledge that what they had built together would hold. The next morning, Conrad hitched the wagon and rode into town with Gabriel beside him, bundled in wool and full of questions about wheels and reins, and how long it took to reach the trading post. Zadie stayed behind with Grace, who helped her wash linens and hang them over the line while birds darted between the trees. By the time the wagon returned, the sun had slipped behind the ridge. Conrad handed Zadie a bundle wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a pair of sturdy boots for Gabriel, a tin of molasses for Grace, and a square of chocolate wrapped in wax cloth for her. I thought it was past time you had something sweet, he said, brushing dirt from his sleeve. She looked up at him, eyes warm. I already do. They ate supper by lamplight, and afterward Conrad carried Grace to her bed while Zadie braided Gabriel's hair the way he liked to keep it from tangling in his sleep. Outside, the wind shifted, bringing with it the first flakes of snow. It fell soft and slow, dusting the porch and fence, catching in the eaves and along the rim of the well. Later, wrapped together in the narrow bed they'd made their own, Zadie rested her head against Conrad's chest. What will we do when spring comes? She asked. Plant, he said. Fence the south slope, maybe raise chicks if we can keep the foxes out. And after that, he tilted his head to look at her. Whatever you want, we've got time. She traced a line across his collarbone. I want to stay right here with you. His hand slid up her back, steady and sure. Then that's what we'll do. The snow thickened through the night, muffling the woods and cabin alike. Inside, the fire burned low and warm, and the quiet was not empty, but full. Of breath shared, of small dreams steadying into real ones, of a love that had come back not in a rush, but in a long, slow return. Months passed. The cellar stayed full through winter. The children grew taller. Gabriel learned to tie knots, and Grace began naming the hens. The garden took root that spring, and the potatoes came in thick and stubborn. Zadie taught herself to quilt with scraps traded from Mrs. Yates, and Conrad built a second room onto the cabin with lumber hauled from town. On a clear April morning, as the creek ran fast from meltwater and the air smelled of new grass, they stood side by side on the porch, watching the children chase each other past the fence. Zadie's hand rested on her belly, and Conrad's rested over hers. He kissed her temple. I never thought I'd have this, he said. She leaned into him. You do now. And they did. A quiet life, hard-earned and full. A home built not from what they had started with, but from what they had chosen each day after each fence post driven, each meal shared, each night spent side by side as the wind moved through the trees and the world turned steady around them.